There are moments in life you can never walk back from. Tiny, almost trivial-seeming moments, the kind that arrive without fanfare and pass without warning, but they split your life into before and after in a way nothing else can. That Sunday morning was one of them. The sun was gentle, the coffee was warm, and the quiet hum of a peaceful house wrapped around me like a favorite sweater. Emily had left earlier than usual, saying she was meeting her sister for hot yoga. I had no reason not to believe her. After all, we'd been married for 4 years, and in those 4 years I'd learned to see her as the safest place I'd ever known. Loyal, honest, brilliant, steady. That was Emily. At least it was the version of her I had committed my soul to. I moved slowly that morning. There was no rush. The silence of an empty house on a Sunday can feel like a rare luxury when you're used to the rhythm of working weeks, meetings, and mundane responsibilities. I poured myself another cup of coffee and leaned against the kitchen counter, watching steam curl lazily up from the mug. That's when I saw it. Her laptop was still open. It sat there on the island counter, lid half raised, the soft white glow of the screen spilling across the polished granite. Nothing unusual, I told myself. She must have forgotten to shut it down. Emily was usually meticulous with her devices. She never left things open, never left tabs visible, and certainly never left messages exposed. But that morning she had. At first I walked past it. I wasn't a snooper, I never had been. Trust is the foundation of any marriage, and I believed we had it. I believed in giving each other space. But there was something about the screen, an eerie pull I couldn't explain. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was paranoia, or maybe, deep down, a part of me already knew. I took a breath, I approached. I told myself I was just going to close it, just a quick tap of the trackpad to put it to sleep. That's all. But when I touched the mouse, the screen sprang fully to life, and there it was. Facebook Messenger, still open, a conversation mid-scroll. The last message stared at me in cruel clarity. You sure he doesn't suspect anything? My stomach dropped. Directly beneath it was Emily's reply. He's too naive to notice. He still thinks I'm working late. The blood drained from my face. My hands trembled. In that single moment, every breath I'd ever taken in her presence, every memory I'd ever thought of as sacred, cracked like glass under a slow, crushing weight. I could have stopped there. I should have, but I didn't. I scrolled up. The messages flowed like acid, playful, intimate, familiar. A man named Ethan, a name I didn't recognize, a name never spoken in our home, never seen in her contacts, never mentioned in passing. Yet here he was, invading the space I thought belonged only to us. The deeper I read, the colder I became. They had history. This wasn't some drunken one-night mistake or flirtatious novelty. This was deliberate, ongoing, organized. She had been with him while telling me she was at networking events. She had told him she loved waking up next to him, while I'd been sleeping alone in our bed, convinced she was chasing promotions. They joked about me, my routines, my predictability, my boring love for early dinners and movie nights. He called me Mr. Vanilla. She called me dependable, but not in a loving way. In the way you describe a used car that gets you from A to B but makes you yawn at the wheel. I felt myself splitting apart. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she wrote them, casual, effortless, like I was nothing more than a background character in a story she no longer wanted to be part of. She told him she felt alive with him. She told him she'd be free soon, that she had a plan. My heart pounded, but it was the kind of pounding that comes before a collapse. I sat down on the stool, reading until my eyes blurred. Photos, plans, hotel bookings, code words, everything was there. Evidence of not just infidelity, but of emotional betrayal, of psychological abandonment. She wasn't just cheating, she was already gone. Her body came home to me, but her soul had left a long time ago. And the worst part was, I had no idea. I closed the laptop slowly, carefully, as if I were sealing something evil back into its container. But it was too late. The evil had already escaped. It had seeped into me, into our home, into every memory that used to feel safe. When she returned later that morning, she was all smiles and light. Her cheeks flushed from the gym, hair tied back, a bottle of pressed juice in hand. She kissed me on the cheek, laughing about how her instructor nearly killed her with a new pose. I nodded. I played along. I smiled. But something inside me had already died. That evening I watched her across the dinner table. The way she twirled her fork absent-mindedly. The way she scrolled through her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. She had no idea what I knew. She still believed in the version of me that had been blind. But I wasn't that man anymore. That night as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling. Her breathing beside me was soft, steady, innocent. She slept so easily, so guiltlessly. And I lay there, unraveling, drowning in a sea of questions I couldn't ask. Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? Did she ever really love me, or was I just a stepping stone to a life she now believed she deserved more from? I tried to remember the last time we laughed, the last time she looked at me with softness, the last time I felt seen by her, and all I could come up with were echoes, distant, hollow, meaningless now. People talk about heartbreak like it's loud, like it screams or crashes through your life like a storm. But for me, it was silence. It was the silence of a house too clean, a bed too neat, a life too routine. It was the silence of trust eroding quietly until all that was left was a man lying awake beside a stranger. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't explode or demand answers. What would be the point? She would deny, she would cry, she would twist it. I'd seen enough betrayal in those messages to know how skilled she was at performance. So I made a decision. I would wait. I would observe. I would collect every piece of this puzzle until there was no way for her to lie her way out of it. Not to me, not to anyone. I needed the truth, not just to hurt her with it, but to understand how long I'd been living in a fantasy. The days ahead would be difficult. I knew that, pretending, smiling, watching, but I had no choice. Because the man I was yesterday, the man who trusted blindly and loved fully, was gone. And the man who remained had one mission: uncover the whole truth, and decide what kind of man he'd become when he finally stood in it. The morning after I discovered the messages, the world around me looked the same, but I knew I would never see it the same again. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee Emily liked to brew. Her slippers were still by the back door, perfectly aligned. The half-eaten apple she'd left on the counter was browning quietly in the sunlight. But now every detail felt like a lie. Our home had become a museum of illusions, an elegant structure built on crumbling trust. I moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to disturb anything, careful to keep up appearances. She came downstairs humming, hair damp from the shower, and kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. I watched her walk out the door as if I were watching the last scene of a film I had loved until the ending betrayed me. And then, once I was alone again, I started. I began with her calendar. I knew the passwords. She never bothered hiding them. I had once taken that as a sign of how open we were with each other, how strong our bond was. But now I understood it differently. It wasn't trust. It was confidence, her confidence in my ignorance, her belief that I would never question her, never look too closely, and until yesterday she'd been right. Her work calendar was immaculate, color-coded, detailed, seemingly honest. Meetings with clients, team check-ins, deadlines for proposals. But nestled between real entries, I noticed patterns, recurring blocks of time marked simply as admin or internal. Meetings that didn't appear on the company's shared calendar. Gaps where her location was unaccounted for. I highlighted every one of them and cross-checked with text messages, call logs, even bank statements. Then I dug deeper. I remembered she used a second email address, one she claimed was for her freelance work before she got her current job. She hadn't mentioned it in years, but I remembered the username. I tried it. The password was a variation of her childhood dog's name and our anniversary, lazy but typical, and just like that, I was inside. There it was. Confirmation after confirmation, receipts for hotel rooms under different names, rideshare records from places that didn't match the locations she said she'd been, spa appointments in the middle of client meetings. An entire second life running in parallel to the one she shared with me. My heart didn't break again, it hardened. Betrayal stops hurting after a while. Eventually it calcifies, turning into something else. Focus, calculation. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was determined. I needed help. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a college friend named Mason who now worked in cybersecurity. We had drifted apart after graduation, but I knew he still lived in the city and occasionally posted about his work. I didn't tell him the details. I just said I suspected something and needed help accessing deleted data. Mason was skeptical at first, but he owed me a favor from back in our college days, and eventually he agreed. By that evening, I had a small folder of recovered messages, phone backups, even browser histories. I learned that Emily had created a hidden cloud drive. I learned that she and Ethan had been meeting for over 8 months. And I learned something even worse. She had considered leaving me more than once, but decided not to for now, because, in her words, it would complicate the finances. I stared at that sentence for hours. She didn't stay because of love or guilt or hope for repair. She stayed because of money, because it was easier, because it was convenient. That night, while she was curled up beside me watching television, I stared at her out of the corner of my eye. She laughed at something on the screen, resting her head on my shoulder, completely unaware that I knew everything. That I had seen every word, every kiss, every lie. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply let the weight of it settle over me like a slow snowfall suffocating everything underneath. I began tracking her in real time. It was easy. I installed a small app on her phone using the laptop while she was in the shower. I justified it not out of malice but necessity. If she could live a double life in secret, then I had a right to know where the truth ended and the performance began. Over the next week, I followed her patterns. Tuesday afternoons, she worked late. Thursday mornings, she had strategy calls. And on Saturday, while she told me she was having brunch with her sister, I watched from my parked car across the street as she met Ethan at a boutique hotel. I didn't follow them inside. I didn't need to. Seeing them together was enough. The way they walked, the way she smiled up at him, touched his arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The intimacy wasn't dramatic. It was casual, lived in, familiar, like I had already been replaced and didn't even know it. I sat in that car for nearly 2 hours. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't break down. Instead, I felt my mind sharpening. My thoughts became methodical, cold, detached. The man who had once held her hand through illness, who had stayed up late helping her with work presentations, who had written love letters for anniversaries and handmade gifts at Christmas, he was gone now, replaced by someone quieter, more dangerous. I began collecting screenshots, recordings, GPS logs, voice memos, email exports. I wanted everything, not for revenge, not even for confrontation. I wasn't sure yet what I would do, but I knew I needed it. I needed the full picture. I needed to understand the scope of the collapse before I could decide how to rebuild. Each evening we continued our charade. Dinner at the table, weekend plans, good-night kisses. She didn't notice the difference in me, or if she did, she chose not to acknowledge it. Maybe she thought I was tired. Maybe she assumed she still had me completely under her control. Either way, it didn't matter. Because she was already gone. I started sleeping in the guest room under the pretense of a sore back. She didn't protest. She seemed relieved. She used the space to FaceTime Ethan late at night, thinking I was asleep or out of earshot, but I was. I heard everything. She told him she was close to being free, that she just needed to push through a few more weeks. She mentioned lawyers, finances, a clean break. But I noticed something strange in her tone. It wasn't excitement. It was calculation. It was nerves. It was fear. I wondered then, was she staying for convenience or was there something else? Had she entangled herself in something she couldn't control? Had Ethan been everything she wanted, or had he become a complication too? The dynamic between them, once so giddy and passionate in the messages, was now tinged with impatience. He pushed, she stalled, he made plans, she avoided timelines, and suddenly I realized she wasn't just lying to me, she was lying to him too. That revelation hit me harder than I expected. She wasn't torn between two loves, she was manipulating both of us. Playing both sides, keeping every door open in case one slammed shut. In that moment, something inside me clicked into place. I would not confront her, not yet. I would let her walk herself into the corner she'd been painting for months. I would let her underestimate me. I would let her think I was broken and naive, harmless and small. And then, when the time was right, I would show her who I really was. I was no longer the man who made her breakfast every Sunday. I was no longer the man who wrote "I love you" notes and left them in her coat pocket. That man was dead. The man who remained would not be betrayed again. I had always thought of betrayal as a single act, a defining blow, a moment when the knife goes in. But now I knew better. True betrayal is slow. It accumulates in shadows, breathes in silence, and grows in the spaces where trust once lived. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And in that whisper it builds a second life behind your back, all while looking you in the eye. Each day that passed after I saw those messages was an exercise in emotional choreography. I performed the part of the husband. I prepared breakfast. I asked about her meetings. I left notes on the fridge. I laughed at the right moments, nodded at the right cues, played my part in the silent theater we called a marriage. But behind my mask I was watching, recording, memorizing. Emily, for her part, was an actress of skill. She maintained her script with precision. She smiled when expected, touched my arm at dinner, even leaned in for a kiss at bedtime, though it never lingered. But I began to notice the cracks, the small delays in her responses, the tension in her shoulders when she thought I wasn't looking. Her gaze drifted often toward the door, the phone, the clock, as if her mind was always elsewhere. The more I watched her, the more alien she became. I thought I knew her. I thought I understood the rhythms of her soul. But now I began to realize how little I truly knew. How many secrets had she buried under the daily rituals of our life? How long had she been practicing this second self, fine-tuning the art of deceit? The most insidious part wasn't her affair. It was how normal she made it seem. How seamlessly she moved through our shared life while emotionally residing in another. I marveled at her audacity, how she could smile at me in the morning, send messages to Ethan in the afternoon, and return home with a kiss in the evening. Still, I said nothing. I did nothing. I became a mirror, reflecting back whatever she needed to see. But inside, I was constructing a plan. Not out of revenge, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. If she was building a future without me, then I would quietly build one without her. But mine would be based on truth, not the illusion she fed me. I hired a private investigator. It was a discreet process, cash payments, no digital trail. He was efficient, professional, and disturbingly thorough. Within a week, I had everything I already knew confirmed, along with several things I didn't. Photos, dates, financial transfers, secret rental agreements under pseudonyms. She wasn't just having an affair. She was building an escape hatch. I learned she had been siphoning small amounts of money from our shared account. Nothing dramatic. Just 100 here, 200 there, deposited into a secondary account I hadn't even known existed. Over time, it had added up to thousands. Enough to start over. Enough to leave without needing me for a dime. The betrayal went deeper than I imagined. She wasn't just planning to leave. She was planning to erase me. Still, I waited. I began shifting money silently, redirecting investments, moving assets she didn't know about. I updated my will, changed my beneficiaries. I met with a lawyer, crafted a prenuptial reinforcement agreement, and placed my most valuable belongings in a secure location. Not because I feared losing them, but because I wanted control. I wanted for once to be the architect of my own fate. Every evening, I returned home to a house that felt less like mine. The walls, once warm with shared memories, now felt like the backstage of a play I no longer believed in. I looked at framed photos with suspicion. Each smile captured in glass felt like a joke told at my expense. Still, I played along. We hosted a small dinner for friends one weekend. She wore the red dress I once bought her in Paris. She laughed at my stories. She touched my hand as if nothing had changed. But I saw through her. I watched the way her phone never left her side, the way her eyes darted toward every message notification. I knew she was balancing two realities, and I let her think I hadn't noticed. It wasn't cowardice, it was preparation. Letting her underestimate me was the only weapon I had left. She believed I was fragile, unaware, soft-hearted, and slow. She believed she had outmaneuvered me, and for a while maybe she had. But the man I had become, shaped by silence, tempered by pain, was not the man she once knew. I became sharper in every way, my focus intensified. I learned her language of lies, her cadence of deception. I anticipated her every move. I studied her like a puzzle, not to fix her, but to understand how thoroughly she had undone the life we once shared. The most difficult part of each day was pretending not to care. It wasn't just a performance, it was a suffocation. Each night as I lay beside her, my mind reeled with images. Her lips on another man, her body curled against someone else. Her secrets whispered into phones and pillows that weren't ours. I began to have dreams, hollow, echoing dreams of drowning in rooms filled with voices I couldn't understand. I woke up breathless, my chest tight, my heart hammering in the dark. Some mornings I would stare at myself in the mirror and not recognize the man looking back. But I never broke. My resolve became my sanctuary. I began keeping a journal, not of my pain but of my observations, dates, patterns, facial expressions, words she repeated. I cataloged everything, not because I thought I could change her, but because I needed to make sense of the maze she had built. If I could map her duplicity, perhaps I could survive it. I began seeing a therapist under an alias. It helped, not because it offered solutions, but because it gave me space to bleed in a room where no one knew my name. I spoke of betrayal in general terms. I never said her name. I never even admitted I was married. I just released fragments of myself into that sterile room, and in doing so, I learned to breathe again. One evening, as I watched Emily fall asleep, I realized something that startled me. I no longer hated her. What I felt was worse, indifference. The woman I loved, the real Emily, the one I proposed to on a snowy night in Boston, the one who danced barefoot in our kitchen, who cried when I read her poetry, that woman no longer existed. Maybe she never had. Maybe I only saw what I wanted to see. But whoever she had become, she was a stranger now. And the grief I carried wasn't just for the betrayal. It was for the death of an illusion I had once cherished. I began preparing my exit, not just from the marriage, but from the version of myself who had needed her. I planned every detail, quietly, strategically. The lawyer helped. So did the investigator. I gathered what I needed. I timed my moves. I scheduled meetings she didn't know about, signed documents in offices she'd never step into. I crafted my goodbye not with words, but with action. I would not give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. I would not beg, I would not rage, I would not cry. I would disappear from her life with the same grace she failed to give me. And when I left, I would leave behind not a mess, but a mirror, one that reflected everything she tried to bury, everything she chose to destroy. Let her face herself when the dust settled. Let her finally see the woman she had become. By the time I had all the pieces in place, I no longer recognized myself, not in the mirror, not in the memories, not even in the quiet corners of my own mind. Grief had passed through me like a tide and retreated, leaving something cold and exacting in its wake. I was no longer mourning a marriage. I was performing a dismantling. Everything was ready. The documents had been signed. The financial safeguards had been activated. The exit plan I had so meticulously constructed over the last few months sat neatly in a folder on my desktop, encrypted and duplicated across 2 drives, one of which now sat in a fireproof safe at my attorney's office. There were no loose ends, no gaps, no questions left unanswered. What began as heartbreak had become an operation. On the outside, I was unchanged. I still wore the same watch, still drove the same car, still made coffee in the same way each morning. I kissed her on the forehead. I asked about her day. I pretended with surgical precision. But within me, the man she thought she could deceive had vanished. In his place stood something harder, something patient, something waiting. I decided on a Friday, not because of any symbolic meaning, but because it gave me the weekend to vanish. She wouldn't suspect anything unusual about a Friday breakfast. She wouldn't hear anything strange in the way I stirred my coffee or packed my briefcase. And she certainly wouldn't notice the way I deleted every trace of myself from the home that, until recently, had been ours. The night before, I watched her sleep for a long time. It struck me that I no longer felt betrayed. That wound had long since scarred. What I felt now was clarity, sharp and unforgiving. Her presence in our home had become a kind of echo, a voice repeating old lines in a play whose meaning had long been lost. She was no longer the antagonist. She was simply an ending. That morning I left early. I didn't take much, just the things that mattered, my birth certificate, my journals, a few photos that meant something to me before all of this unraveled. Everything else, the clothes, the furniture, the shared memories, felt like ash in my hands. I took only what I could carry. The rest was hers now, a museum of her performance. Before I left, I placed an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was everything she thought she had hidden. Printed emails, screenshots, GPS logs, photos, a summary of financial transfers, a copy of the hotel receipts, and at the top of the stack, a letter not of rage, not of sorrow, but of release. I didn't need to accuse her. She already knew what she had done. I only needed her to know that I had seen all of it and that I had chosen to leave with dignity, something she never gave me. Then I walked out the door. I didn't look back. Not once. It was raining, lightly, the kind of rain that softens the edges of everything it touches. The streets were quiet and the air smelled like change. I drove away from that house, from that life, from that version of myself, and felt the weight of it all begin to lift, not in joy but in finality. It was over. And this time it wasn't because she had ended it. It was because I had. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I checked into a small hotel across town, anonymous, clean, temporary. I didn't want comfort. I wanted distance. I spent the afternoon sending the final files to my lawyer, confirming the split of accounts, executing the pre-signed separation agreement. Everything had already been approved. All that remained now was the fallout, and that I left to her. By evening, I received the first message. It came from her personal email, the one she never used unless she was truly desperate. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Her confusion, her panic, her sudden need to talk. It all arrived right on schedule, predictable, scripted, powerless. I had no intention of replying. Later that night, I walked through the city, letting the unfamiliar streets blur the edges of my memories. I passed families at dinner, couples holding hands, children laughing through puddles. Once, these sights would have made me ache with nostalgia. But now, I simply observed. I was a man in transit, a man who had stepped outside of a life that had pretended to love him. Back in the hotel room, I sat in the silence and let it settle around me. No voices. No tension. No mask. Just breath. For the first time in months, I wasn't pretending. The next morning, her calls began. Dozens of them, some from her number, some from unknown numbers trying to bypass the block I had already placed. I watched them ring without touching the phone. Each one was a bell tolling for a future she could no longer control. She had underestimated me to the very end. Believed the version of me she created in her messages, the naive, the passive, the boring. But I had never been that man. I had simply loved her. And love, when betrayed, does not disappear. It becomes something else. A mirror, a flame, a silence. 3 days passed. On the 4th, she sent a letter, handwritten, slid under the door of the lawyer's office and forwarded to me. I read it once. It was filled with explanations, with apologies laced in self-defense, with phrases like, "I never meant to hurt you," and "it got out of control." She said she still cared. She said she still wanted to understand. But it was too late. Understanding wasn't the problem. The problem was her willingness to become someone else entirely behind my back. The problem was how easy it had become for her to lie. The problem was how long she let me live in a story that no longer included me. I burned the letter. Not out of anger, but because some things are not worth keeping. The days that followed were quiet. I began rebuilding. Not the life I had before, but something new. I rented a small studio apartment in a part of the city I had always liked but never lived in. I bought a new bed, new dishes, a second-hand sofa that creaked when I sat down but somehow made me smile. I filled my nights with books and long walks. I enrolled in a photography class. I reconnected with a friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Each morning, I woke alone. And each morning, I breathed a little easier. There were still moments, flickers, when her ghost drifted through my thoughts. A scent on the wind, a song in a coffee shop, but they didn't break me anymore. They passed through me. Echoes of a lesson learned the hard way. I never told anyone the full story. People asked, of course. Mutual friends, her family, even mine. I said we had grown apart. I said we'd chosen to go separate ways. I let them think whatever they needed to. The truth wasn't for them. The truth was mine, and I had already buried it in a way no conversation could exhume. Sometimes people want revenge. I never did. Revenge is just another tether to what broke you. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't want her to suffer. I only wanted space between us, clear, irreversible space. I wanted her to remember, if she ever did, not what I said, but how completely I left, how silently. That, I knew, would haunt her more than any scream ever could. And so I lived. And so I healed. And so I became someone she would never truly know. They say truth sets you free, but they never tell you what it does to the people who spent their lives avoiding it. Truth, when delivered without warning, doesn't merely hurt, it dismantles. It strips the masks, floods the shadows, burns the comfortable illusions to the ground. That's what Emily now had to face. I didn't witness her unraveling directly. That was never my intention. I had no desire to gloat or spectate. I simply stepped away, left the mirror behind, and allowed her to confront what she had built in my absence. But word travels, and in the silence I kept, others began to speak. Her job had been the first to notice. It began with missed deadlines, half-hearted presentations, tension in meetings she once led with ease. I knew her well enough to understand that she was unraveling from the inside out. Deception, once uncovered, leaves stains on the tongue. It makes the simplest tasks feel slippery. When you've spent months building 2 lives, it's hard to keep standing when one collapses. She had grown accustomed to compartmentalizing me, our marriage, her affair, her ambitions. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she had broken down in the middle of a staff meeting, that she had snapped at a junior colleague, that she had taken a sudden leave of absence. None of this surprised me. She had crafted her stability on a foundation of dishonesty, and when that foundation cracked, the whole structure began to lean. The fallout with Ethan had been inevitable. He, like me, had been sold a version of her that didn't exist. Unlike me, however, he had entered willingly into a web of deceit. Still, I imagined his ego hadn't fared well when he learned that she had lied to him too. About the timing, about her intentions, about the money she had siphoned, about the promises she'd made to both of us. A part of me suspected she had believed her own lies, that she had convinced herself she could have it all: control, affection, security, escape. But lies, once exposed to daylight, rot quickly. They leave behind a scent that no amount of denial can cover. Eventually, people notice. Eventually, the story unravels. I never asked for details. I didn't care whether Ethan left her, whether he confronted her, whether he, too, slipped away in silence. All I cared about was the widening distance between her world and mine. I had left her with her choices, and now those choices had begun to echo. Her family reached out next. Not to me directly, but through channels, messages left with mutual friends, vague apologies masked as concern. They wanted to understand, or perhaps they wanted to explain. I refused all contact. I wasn't interested in apologies that arrived only after the fire. Their silence during our marriage had been deafening. They had watched her become someone else and said nothing. That kind of silence is complicity. Eventually, even the messages stopped. The final flickers of her presence arrived in the form of logistics. Legal acknowledgments, confirmation of the finalized separation, transfer of ownership for the home we once shared, signatures on documents that once would have felt like tearing apart skin, but now they passed through my hands like dust. I signed without hesitation. The ink flowed like closure. With each passing day, I felt lighter. There was no joy in her destruction. I hadn't orchestrated it. I hadn't hoped for it. I had simply stepped away and allowed her to face the consequence of her own decisions. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want her to suffer. I wanted her to learn, not for my sake, but for hers. Because people like her, if they never meet themselves honestly, will repeat their cruelty again and again. Not just with lovers, but with everyone they touch. Some nights I wondered if she ever truly saw herself in the wreckage. Not as the victim, not as the misunderstood woman chasing passion, but as the architect of her own collapse. I would never know. That wasn't my burden to carry anymore. In the months that followed, I found something unexpected: stillness. It didn't come all at once. At first, it felt like silence, a frightening void where noise used to live. The absence of lies, the absence of tension, the absence of someone moving through the house pretending to love me. But slowly, that silence became something else. It became clarity. I no longer woke with a weight on my chest. I no longer flinched at the sound of a message notification. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head just to prepare for another disappointment. Instead, I found myself noticing small things, things I had forgotten to cherish. The way morning light filtered through my new apartment window, the smell of clean sheets, the sound of rain against the roof when there was no one beside me pretending. I went back to old habits. Books I'd left unfinished, parks I used to walk in, music I hadn't listened to in years. I began taking care of my health again, not for appearance, but because it felt good to reclaim ownership of my body. I changed my routines. I changed my space. Slowly, I changed myself. I didn't erase her. That would have been too easy. I kept a single photo of us, buried in a box I almost never opened. Not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for the version of myself who once believed. That man, naive though he may have been, loved with sincerity, and I refused to let betrayal corrupt that part of me. Trust, I learned, wasn't a mistake. Giving it to the wrong person was. But the act itself, that vulnerability, that faith, is what makes us human. I wouldn't lose that part of me. I would carry it forward, but now with discernment, with stronger boundaries, with a deeper understanding of what it means to protect my peace. The world didn't end when she betrayed me. It began again. On different soil, under different skies, with quieter mornings and softer nights. With no one to lie to me, no one to lie for, just breath, just being. Sometimes the deepest power lies not in what we say, but in what we choose to walk away from. I walked away from the need to be right. I walked away from the fantasy that she would ever truly understand what she destroyed. And I walked toward a version of myself that no longer needed answers from her. She would live with her choices. And I finally was learning how to live with mine. Time, when left to its own devices, does what no apology ever can. It doesn't heal in the way people think. It doesn't erase, doesn't soften all things into sweetness, but it reshapes. It rounds the jagged edges of grief, layers memory with enough distance that even the sharpest betrayals lose their ability to cut. And in that quiet erosion, something unexpected begins to grow. Peace, not because all is forgiven, but because it no longer matters enough to hurt. Months passed and then more. The seasons shifted with an indifference that mirrored my own slow return to selfhood. The trees shed their leaves, the sky changed color, and life moved forward, without ceremony, without permission. It didn't ask if I was ready, it simply continued, and I did too. The apartment I had moved into became more than a place of exile, it became mine. Each object in it had been chosen by me for me. There were no ghosts in the corners, no lingering traces of her perfume in the closet, no memories seeping through walls, just space, clean and quiet, a sanctuary. I found comfort in repetition, in the small rituals of living alone, the way I made my bed every morning, the precise method I used to grind my coffee, the stack of books that grew on the nightstand, each one finished with the satisfaction of a man reclaiming time. I had no one to perform for, no one to impress. I began to move through my life with intention rather than habit. Sometimes people asked if I was dating again. Friends, colleagues, they meant well. They asked with curiosity, with kindness, with the implication that to be healed meant to be partnered again. But I didn't feel the need to replace absence with presence. I wasn't lonely. I was alone, and for the first time in a long time, those weren't the same thing. I had conversations with myself now, honest ones. I wrote in my journal at night, not because I was keeping track of pain, but because I had started listening to the quiet voice within me that had long been drowned out by compromise. I asked myself difficult questions, not about her anymore, about me. Who had I been before the betrayal? Who had I allowed myself to become in the name of peace? What part of me had been complicit in my own forgetting? There were no easy answers, but there was space now to ask, and in that space I grew. Forgiveness, if it ever came, arrived in a form I hadn't expected, not as a moment, not as a single breath of release, but as a slow detachment. I stopped replaying the memories, stopped imagining the confrontations I never had, stopped needing to understand the why. The truth was, understanding wouldn't change anything. Her betrayal had never been about me. It had been about her, about what she lacked, what she feared, what she wanted to escape from. I had simply been in the way. That realization freed me more than any apology ever could have. There came a day, an ordinary one, gray and unremarkable, when I realized I had gone an entire week without thinking of her. Not in bitterness, not in longing, just nothing. The space she had once occupied in my mind was now filled with other things. Music, plans, ideas. The world had crept back in through the cracks she had left behind. Eventually, I took a trip. Not to run away, but to return to a place I had visited long before we met. A small coastal town with crooked streets and salt in the air. I stayed in a modest inn overlooking the sea. I walked barefoot on the sand in the early morning, letting the cold wake me. I wrote pages in my notebook, watched strangers pass without story, and let the silence settle. It was there on the third day that I finally said goodbye, not to her, but to the version of myself that had clung to the past. I sat on a worn bench at the edge of a cliff, watching the horizon blur into the clouds, and felt something shift. I no longer needed closure. Closure was not something she could give me. It was not a door she could open or a sentence she could say. Closure was what I built with every boundary I upheld, with every moment I chose truth over illusion, with every step I took away from a life that had asked me to shrink. I had spent so much time trying not to become bitter, and somewhere along the way I realized I didn't have to try anymore. I wasn't bitter, I was better, not perfect, not invulnerable, but present, awake, whole in a way I hadn't known I'd been missing. I returned from that trip with no great revelations. No thunderclap of transformation, just steadiness, just peace, the kind that doesn't need to be named, only noticed. Back home, I passed by the bakery we used to visit together and felt nothing. I no longer walked the streets carrying ghosts. I walked with myself, and that was enough. She tried once more to reach out. An email, brief, vague, nostalgic maybe. A few lines that suggested regret without naming it. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but clarity. There was nothing left to say. What once was broken had long since been buried. I had no desire to resurrect it. Some things end without ceremony. Some betrayals do not require confrontation. Some goodbyes are quiet. And yet, even in their silence, they set you free. I look at the life I have now and feel something close to reverence. Not for what happened, but for what I learned. I know myself better. I love myself more fiercely. I guard my peace the way one guards sacred ground, not with fear, but with respect. If I were to ever love again, it would be different. Not because I'm afraid, but because I know the value of truth now. I know what it costs to live in a home of half-truths. I know the sound of silence that doesn't soothe, only deceives. And I will never again mistake performance for love. One evening, I lit a candle for no reason at all. Just to sit in the light. Just to mark the moment. I realized then how far I had come, from the man who shook while reading secret messages to the man who no longer needed anyone else's version of the story. She left her laptop open, and in doing so, she opened a door I was never meant to walk through. But I did. And on the other side of that door, I didn't find her. I found myself,